The morning of June 4th, 1942, 0530 hours, 30 miles northwest of Midway Atoll. Lieutenant Commander John Thach pressed his throttle forward, feeling the Grumman F4F Wildcat shudder beneath him as it climbed through 6,000 feet. Through his windscreen, he could see 5 other Wildcats from Fighting Squadron 3, their stubby silhouettes unmistakable against the Pacific dawn. Below them, 12 Douglas Devastator torpedo bombers lumbered toward the Japanese fleet, slow and vulnerable, carrying torpedoes that would likely fail even if they reached their targets. Thach knew what was coming. Intelligence reports had described the Mitsubishi A6M Zero in terms that bordered on supernatural. Faster than anything America had in the air. More maneuverable than seemed physically possible. Armed with 20mm cannons that could tear a Wildcat apart with a single burst. And flown by pilots who had been honing their skills over China while American naval aviators practiced over empty ocean. In 60 seconds, 15 to 20 Zeros would fall on Thach's 6 Wildcats like wolves on wounded sheep. In the cockpit, Thach had a notebook strapped to his knee. On it, he had sketched a tactical formation using matchsticks and diagrams. He called it beam defense position. His wingmen called it suicide with extra steps. Because the truth was undeniable and terrifying. The airplane Thach was flying, the airplane the United States Navy had bet everything on, was pitifully inferior to the enemy in climb, maneuverability, and speed. The Wildcat was not designed to fight the Zero. It was designed to fight an enemy that did not exist. An enemy slower and heavier and more forgiving than the reality screaming toward them at 300 miles per hour. And now, with American carrier decks burning at Pearl Harbor and Japanese forces advancing across the Pacific like a rising tide, there was no time to build better fighters. There was only time to learn how not to die. What happened in the next 7 minutes would determine whether American pilots could survive long enough to turn the war around. Whether tactics could overcome technology. Whether 6 outmatched Wildcats could protect 12 doomed torpedo bombers long enough to give those bombers a chance. Thach's hands tightened on the stick. The formation he was about to try had worked in practice flights over San Diego. But practice was not combat. And the Zero pilots racing toward him were not interested in practice. In the silence of war, countless stories were almost forgotten. If this story moved you, please subscribe to Silent Battlefield and help keep their memory alive. The F4F Wildcat looked wrong from the moment you saw it. Stubby fuselage, barely 28 feet 9 inches long. Short wings spanning 38 feet. Landing gear that retracted but left the wheels partially exposed, creating drag that robbed the aircraft of precious speed. It looked like something designed by committee, by engineers who had never seen combat, by men who believed American pilots would face enemies as poorly equipped as themselves. They were half right. The Wildcat had been designed for a different war. Development began in 1936 when the United States Navy needed to replace its biplane fighters with modern monoplanes. Grumman Aircraft Engineering Corporation, a company with a reputation for building tough naval aircraft, proposed a design that prioritized one thing above all else: survival. Leroy Grumman, the company's founder, had watched too many pilots die in aircraft that disintegrated under carrier stress. He wanted fighters that could take punishment, that could survive bad landings on pitching carrier decks, that could absorb enemy fire and bring their pilots home. So he built the Wildcat with self-sealing fuel tanks, armor plate behind the pilot's seat, a sturdy airframe that could absorb damage that would shatter lighter aircraft, and 650 caliber machine guns in the wings, heavy weapons that could punch through enemy aircraft at ranges where lighter guns failed. The cost was weight. 2,612 kilograms empty. Nearly 6,000 pounds loaded with fuel and ammunition. That weight, combined with a Pratt & Whitney R1830 twin Wasp engine producing only 1,200 horsepower, meant the Wildcat was slow. Top speed, 318 miles per hour in the F4F3 variant. 320 in the later F4F4 with folding wings and 2 additional machine guns. Climb rate, 2,100 feet per minute at sea level. These numbers looked acceptable on paper in 1939. They looked acceptable when comparing the Wildcat to the biplanes it replaced. They looked acceptable when Navy planners assumed future enemies would fly similar aircraft, heavy fighters built for endurance rather than dogfighting. But by December 1941, when the United States entered the war, these numbers meant death. Because while Grumman was building a fighter designed to survive, Japan was building a fighter designed to kill. The Mitsubishi A6M Zero represented a completely different philosophy of fighter design. While American engineers added armor and self-sealing fuel tanks, Japanese designer Jiro Horikoshi stripped away everything that added weight. No armor, no self-sealing tanks, no heavy structure. Instead, Horikoshi used an aluminum alloy called extra super duralumin, lighter and stronger than anything American factories produced. He designed control surfaces with perfect aerodynamic balance, allowing pilots to maneuver at speeds where American fighters locked up. He mounted an engine producing only 840 horsepower, but in an airframe so light the Zero achieved performance that seemed impossible. Top speed, 346 miles per hour. Climb rate, 4,500 feet per minute. More than twice the Wildcat's climb rate. In a dogfight, the Zero could climb above a Wildcat in seconds, converting altitude advantage into killing position before the American pilot could react. The Zero could turn inside the Wildcat's turning circle, getting on a Wildcat's tail and staying there, while the American pilot pulled desperate evasive maneuvers that only delayed death. The Zero's 20mm cannons, fed by 60-round drums, could destroy a Wildcat with a 2-second burst. And Japanese pilots had been flying combat missions over China since 1937, accumulating experience American naval aviators lacked. When the first reports of Zero capabilities reached American intelligence in 1941, some officers dismissed them as exaggeration. Enemy propaganda. No fighter could be that fast, that maneuverable, that deadly. The reports came from the American Volunteer Group, pilots flying for China against Japanese forces. They described Zeros performing maneuvers that violated everything American pilots knew about fighter combat. They described Japanese pilots who could reverse direction in seconds, who could loop and roll and dive with precision that seemed practiced to perfection. Lieutenant Commander John Thach read these reports in September 1941. He commanded Fighting Squadron 3 aboard USS Saratoga, and he understood immediately what the reports meant. His squadron flew F4F Wildcats. If the reports were accurate, his pilots were flying to their deaths in aircraft completely overmatched by the enemy. Thach could not change the Wildcat. Grumman was already working on next-generation fighters, the F4F Hellcat and the F4F Corsair, but those aircraft were years away from carrier decks. The Wildcat was what American pilots had, and the Wildcat was not enough. So, Thach did the only thing he could do. He started thinking about tactics. In his quarters aboard Saratoga, Thach set up matchsticks on a table. Each matchstick represented a fighter. He moved them around, simulating dogfights, trying to find some formation or maneuver that would give slower American fighters a chance against faster Japanese opponents. He tried traditional three-plane sections. The Zeros picked them apart. He tried pairs flying close together for mutual support. The Zeros separated them and killed them one by one. He tried aggressive attacks, defensive circles, hit-and-run tactics. Nothing worked. Then, one night in late 1941, Thach noticed something. If two Wildcats flew parallel to each other, separated by the tactical diameter of a tight turn, they created a problem for attacking Zeros. If a Zero pursued one Wildcat, that Wildcat could turn toward his wingman. The wingman, seeing his partner under attack, would also turn toward him. The two Wildcats would pass each other, nose to nose, while the pursuing Zero found himself flying through their crossfire. If the Zero tried to follow one Wildcat through the turn, the other Wildcat would be on his tail. If the Zero tried to reverse and engage the second Wildcat, the first would be in position to shoot. And if the two Wildcats kept weaving, crossing and recrossing paths, the Zero pilot would face an impossible choice. Every attack put him at risk from the other Wildcat. Thach called it beam defense position. It was not elegant. It was not aggressive. It would not let Wildcats dogfight Zeros on equal terms. But it might, just might, let American pilots survive long enough to learn how to fight the Zero. To test the tactic, Thach recruited Ensign Edward O'Hare, a young pilot with exceptional flying skills. O'Hare led the second section in Thach's division, and he understood immediately what Thach was trying to achieve. The two men flew practice missions over San Diego, weaving back and forth, refining the timing and distances. They discovered that the maneuver required perfect coordination. If one pilot turned too early or too late, the weave broke down and both pilots were vulnerable. They learned that radio discipline was critical. Short, clear calls to indicate when to turn, when to cross, when a zero was on someone's tail. They practiced until the maneuver became instinctive, until they could execute it without thinking, reacting to each other's movements like dancers performing a rehearsed routine. But practice was not combat. Practice did not include the terror of seeing tracers flash past your canopy. Practice did not include the weight of knowing that a single mistake meant death. Practice did not include 15 Zeros diving on 6 Wildcats with murderous intent. On February 20, 1942, O'Hare would test his skills in actual combat. USS Lexington was operating near Rabaul when Japanese bombers appeared. O'Hare was flying combat air patrol when his wingman's guns jammed, leaving O'Hare alone against 9 Mitsubishi G4M Betty bombers. In 4 minutes, O'Hare shot down 5 bombers and damaged 3 more. He became the Navy's first fighter ace of the war and received the Medal of Honor. But O'Hare was not fighting Zeros. Bombers were slower, less maneuverable, easier targets. The real test would come at Midway. By June 1942, the strategic situation in the Pacific had deteriorated dramatically. Japanese forces controlled a vast arc of territory stretching from the Dutch East Indies to the Marshall Islands. American carriers had been reduced from 8 to 3 after Pearl Harbor and the Battle of Coral Sea. If Japan could destroy those 3 remaining carriers, the United States would lose the ability to project naval power across the Pacific. The Japanese plan was elegant and overwhelming. 4 fleet carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, would strike Midway Atoll with over 200 aircraft. Once American carriers responded, Japanese naval forces would destroy them in a decisive battle that would break American resistance. American codebreakers had intercepted and deciphered Japanese communications, giving Admiral Chester Nimitz advance warning. But knowing the enemy's plan did not change the fundamental problem. American carriers Yorktown, Enterprise, and Hornet carried F4F Wildcats to defend themselves. Those Wildcats would face Japanese Zeros flown by pilots with years of combat experience. The Wildcats were still slower, still less maneuverable, still flying toward an enemy that could outperform them in every measurable category. Thach knew this. His pilots knew this. On the night of June 3rd, Thach briefed his squadron on beam defense position. Some pilots were skeptical. Flying in weaving patterns meant giving up initiative, reacting to enemy attacks rather than pressing attacks of their own. Felt defensive, passive, unheroic. But Thach was blunt. The F4F airplane is pitifully inferior in climb, maneuverability, and speed. Any success our fighter pilots may have against the Japanese Zero fighter is not due to the performance of the airplane we fly, but is the result of superior marksmanship and teamwork of our pilots. We cannot dogfight Zeros. We can only survive long enough to kill them when they make mistakes. That night, pilots wrote letters home. Some made peace with the probability they would not survive the coming battle. Others focused on mechanical preparations, checking guns, fuel systems, oxygen supplies. A few slept poorly, waking to visions of Zeros falling on them like predatory birds. At 0500 on June 4th, Yorktown launched aircraft. Thach led 6 F4F4s from Fighting Squadron 3. Their mission: protect 12 TBD Devastator torpedo bombers attacking the Japanese carriers. The Devastators were obsolete, slow, and notoriously fragile. But they carried the only weapons that could sink carriers from carrier-based aircraft, torpedoes that, if they reached their targets and if they actually worked, could cripple Japanese capital ships. The formation climbed into the dawn. 6 Wildcats, 12 Devastators, against the most powerful carrier task force ever assembled. Thach checked his instruments. Fuel pressure normal. Oil temperature normal. Guns charged and ready. Radio functioning. He looked left and right, confirming his wingmen were in position. Then he looked down at the Devastators, flying straight and level toward their targets, defenseless against enemy fighters. In minutes, the Japanese Combat Air Patrol would find them. In minutes, Thach would discover whether his tactical solution could overcome technological inferiority. In minutes, American pilots would learn whether courage and teamwork could substitute for speed and maneuverability. The radio crackled. Tally-ho. Enemy fighters. 10 o'clock high. Thach looked up. Against the brightening sky he saw them. 15 to 20 Zeros. Diving from altitude. Closing at over 400 miles per hour. He keyed his microphone. VF3. Execute beam defense. Stay with your wingman. Do not break formation. The Zeros screamed down. The test had begun. The first Zero reached firing position at 0922. Ensign Edgar Bassett, flying tail-end position in Thach's formation, never had a chance. The Zero pilot opened fire at 300 yards. 20mm cannon shells stitched through Bassett's Wildcat, punching through aluminum skin, severing control cables, igniting fuel lines. Bassett's aircraft slanted toward the ocean, trailing black smoke. It hit the water at 200 miles per hour and exploded in a sphere of orange flame. 5 Wildcats remained. 15 Zeros circled like sharks who had tasted blood. Thach's voice crackled over the radio, calm despite everything. Dib on me. Execute Weave. Now. Ensign Robert A. M. Dib. Thach's wingman was 22 years old. He had graduated from flight training 3 months earlier. He had never fired his guns in combat. And now he was about to test a tactical maneuver that existed only in theory and brief practice sessions over California. A Zero latched onto Dib's tail. The Japanese pilot was experienced, confident, closing to optimal firing range with the patience of someone who knew his aircraft's superiority. He would fire at 200 yards. He would fire a 2-second burst. Dib's Wildcat would disintegrate. Thach saw it happening. He keyed his radio. Dib, turn toward me. Turn hard. Dib reacted instantly. His Wildcat rolled into a banking turn, pulling 4GS, heading directly at Thach's aircraft. Thach also turned, his Wildcat's nose swinging toward Dib. The 2 American fighters converged, closing at a combined speed of over 600 miles per hour. The Zero pilot, focused on Dib, suddenly realized his mistake. He was no longer chasing one Wildcat. He was flying between 2 Wildcats, both of which had their guns pointed at him. Thach opened fire. 6 50 caliber machine guns, each firing at 800 rounds per minute, created a cone of destruction. The Zero pilot tried to break away, but momentum carried him forward. Thach's tracers walked up the Zero's fuselage. Bullets punched through the engine cowling, through the cockpit, through the fragile structure that gave the Zero its incredible performance. The Zero's unprotected fuel tanks ignited. The aircraft transformed from a graceful fighter into a falling torch. It hit the ocean seconds later, leaving only an oil slick and floating debris. Thach's first kill of the day. But there was no time to celebrate. 3 more Zeros dove on the formation. Thach called Dib. Weave again. Same drill. They executed the maneuver again, and again, crossing paths every 30 seconds. Each time a Zero pursued one Wildcat, the other Wildcat was waiting. Each time a Zero committed an attack, he exposed himself to counterattack. Lieutenant Junior Grade Brainerd McComber, flying the second section with Chief Machinist Tom Cheek and Ensign Daniel Sheedy, watched Thach's Weave with growing understanding. McComber's radio was damaged, so he could not coordinate perfectly with his wingmen. But he saw the pattern. When Zeros attacked, American fighters turned toward each other. When American fighters crossed paths, Zeros died. Cheek, the most experienced pilot after Thach, began executing the Weave without explicit orders. He saw a Zero making a run on another Wildcat. He turned toward the action, positioning himself where the Zero would be forced to fly through his sights. The Zero pilot, focused on his target, did not see Cheek until tracers flashed past his cockpit. Cheek's burst hit the Zero's engine and underside. The aircraft burst into flames and plummeted into the Pacific. Below them, the Devastators continued their torpedo run. 12 aircraft flying straight and level at 150 miles per hour, 100 feet above the ocean, completely vulnerable. The The Zeros that were not engaging Thach's Wildcats fell on the torpedo bombers like executioners. One Devastator exploded. Another crashed into the ocean trailing fire. A third tried to evade, banking desperately, and was cut apart by cannon fire. Thach watched helplessly. His 6 Wildcats could not protect 12 bombers against 15 Zeros. The mathematics were impossible. But the Wildcats could exact a price. Make the Zeros pay for every bomber they killed. Force the Japanese pilots to split their attention between killing bombers and surviving American fighters. Thach destroyed his second Zero when a Japanese pilot made the fatal mistake of following Dib through a weave without checking his 6 o'clock position. The Zero flew directly into Thach's gun sight. A 3-second burst shredded the enemy aircraft. Dib claimed his first kill moments later. A Zero pursuing another Wildcat broke off the attack and reversed course, trying to engage the threat. But the reversal cost him speed and energy. Dib, already positioned for a deflection shot, fired. His bullets hit the Zero's wing root. The wing folded, the aircraft cartwheeled, and the ocean claimed another Japanese pilot. By 0930, 7 minutes after the engagement began, the pattern had become clear to both sides. American Wildcats fighting individually died quickly. Japanese Zeros attacking Wildcats using the weave died nearly as fast. But the weave only worked if pilots maintained perfect discipline, stayed with their wingmen, and executed the crosses with split-second timing. Macomber, frustrated by his damaged radio and isolated from coordination, broke formation. He saw a Zero harassing a damaged Wildcat and turned to help. His intentions were good. His execution was fatal to his own survival. Without a wingman to cover him, Macomber became the target every Zero pilot wanted. Alone, vulnerable, easy prey. 3 Zeros converged on Macomber's Wildcat simultaneously. He evaded the first 2 through violent maneuvering that would have killed a less sturdy aircraft. But the third Zero caught him in a climbing turn. 20mm shells punched through Macomber's left wing, tearing metal, rupturing hydraulic lines. The Wildcat shuddered but kept flying. Grumman's engineering saved Macomber's life. The rugged airframe absorbed damage that would have destroyed a Zero. But Macomber's aircraft was crippled. Reduced speed. Limited maneuverability. He broke away from the engagement, nursing his damaged Wildcat toward friendly forces. Thach claimed his third kill at 0935. A Japanese pilot, perhaps frustrated by the American tactic, abandoned coordinated attacks and committed to a solo gun run on Thach's aircraft. It was exactly the mistake Thach had predicted. The Zero pilot focused on one target, ignoring the second Wildcat in the weave. Dib, crossing behind the Zero at optimal angle, opened fire. The Zero disintegrated. By 0940, the engagement was effectively over. The Devastators, what remained of them, had launched their torpedoes. None hit. The torpedoes ran too deep or too slow or simply failed to detonate. 11 of the 12 Devastators had been shot down. Only 1 crew survived. But Thach's 6 Wildcats had accomplished something unprecedented. Against 15 to 20 Zeros, outnumbered more than 3 to 1, outperformed in speed and maneuverability, the Wildcats had shot down 6 confirmed Japanese fighters. 3 probable kills brought the total to 9. 1 Wildcat had been shot down. 1 had been damaged and forced to retire. 4 remained combat-capable. Thach led them back to Yorktown. The engagement had lasted 18 minutes. 18 minutes that changed American fighter doctrine forever. That afternoon, after the American dive bombers had fatally damaged 3 Japanese carriers, Thach was airborne again. This time flying combat air patrol over Yorktown. He would shoot down another Zero, possibly the leader of the Japanese torpedo bombers attacking the carrier. By day's end, Thach had destroyed 4 enemy aircraft and survived multiple engagements against superior fighters. His weave had worked in combat, but the cost had been severe. World War II is not just history, it is life, pain, and sacrifice. Subscribe to Silent Battlefield to honor those who lived, suffered, and were lost. June 4, 1942 was a disaster and a turning point. A disaster for American torpedo squadrons. Of 41 Devastators launched from 3 carriers that morning, only 6 returned. 35 aircraft and their crews lost. The sacrifice was not in vain, but it was terrible. The slow, vulnerable torpedo bombers had pulled Japanese combat air patrol down to sea level, leaving the high altitude undefended when American dive bombers arrived. Those dive bombers, Douglas SBD Dauntless, destroyed 4 Japanese carriers in 5 minutes of precise bombing. Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu all sunk, the carriers that had attacked Pearl Harbor. The carriers represented Japan's ability to project power across the Pacific. Gone. For American fighter pilots, Midway revealed truths that would reshape naval aviation. The Wildcat was inferior to the Zero in almost every performance category. This was not propaganda. This was an observable fact. Any pilot who tried to dogfight a Zero using traditional tactics died. But the Wildcat had advantages that statistics could not capture. Ruggedness, 6 heavy machine guns, self-sealing fuel tanks, armor protection, and American pilots who could think tactically rather than simply react. Thach's Weave was not perfect. It was defensive, reactive, and required near-perfect coordination. But it gave American pilots a framework for survival. A set of rules that worked. Stay with your wingman. Turn toward threats. Cross paths to create crossfire. Never pursue alone. Never break formation. Never dogfight. After Midway, Thach was pulled from combat operations. The Navy wanted him to teach, to spread the beam defense position to every fighter squadron in the Pacific. The decision made strategic sense but carried personal cost. The Navy's best combat pilots spent the war training others while Japanese pilots stayed in combat until they were killed. By 1943, the experience differential had reversed. American pilots arrived at forward bases with hundreds of training hours. Japanese pilots arrived with minimal preparation, replacing the experienced veterans lost over Midway and Guadalcanal. The kill ratio shifted dramatically. At Midway, Wildcats fighting Zeros achieved roughly 1-to-1 exchange rates in air-to-air combat. By the end of the Guadalcanal campaign in February 1943, Wildcats were shooting down 5.9 Zeros for every Wildcat lost. By war's end, the overall Wildcat versus Zero kill ratio reached 6.9-to-1. These numbers reflected more than the Weave. They reflected American training systems, radar direction, early warning networks, and systematic tactical development. But they also reflected something else. American willingness to admit technological inferiority and compensate with innovation. The Wildcat remained in production throughout the war despite being obsolete by 1943 standards. When the F6F Hellcat and F4U Corsair arrived, Wildcats moved to escort carrier operations. Smaller carriers could not handle the heavier, faster new fighters. But they could operate Wildcats, and Wildcats could still kill. The final Wildcat variant, the FM2 produced by General Motors, optimized the design for escort carrier work, lighter engine, 4 guns instead of 6, improved climb rate. Between September 1944 and August 1945, FM2 Wildcats achieved better kill ratios than either Hellcats or Corsairs in the same period. Not because the Wildcat was superior, because the pilots flying Wildcats had learned how to win with inferior equipment. They had learned Thach's lessons. They had learned that speed and maneuverability mattered less than tactics and teamwork. During the war, Navy and Marine Corps Wildcats flew 15,553 combat sorties. They destroyed a claimed 1,327 enemy aircraft at the cost of 178 aerial losses. These numbers existed because American pilots learned a fundamental truth. The best fighter is not always the fastest or most maneuverable. Sometimes the best fighter is the one that brings you home. The F4F Wildcat brought pilots home. Its rugged construction absorbed punishment that would destroy lighter aircraft. Japanese ace Saburo Sakai, who survived the war and wrote extensively about his experiences, described attacking a Wildcat. I had full confidence in my ability to destroy the Grumman and decided to finish off the enemy fighter with only my 7.7mm machine guns. I turned the 20mm cannon switch to the off position and closed in. For some strange reason, even after I had poured about 500 or 600 rounds of ammunition directly into the Grumman. The airplane did not fall but kept on flying. That Wildcat's pilot escaped. The aircraft absorbed hundreds of bullets and continued flying because Grumman had built it to survive. That design philosophy saved lives throughout the war. The Wildcat's legacy extended beyond combat statistics. Lessons learned from Wildcat operations directly influenced the F4F Hellcat's design. Grumman engineers took the Wildcat's ruggedness, added more power, improved speed and climb rate, but maintained the emphasis on pilot protection and structural strength. The Hellcat became one of the war's most successful fighters, achieving a 19-to-1 kill ratio against Japanese aircraft. But it existed because the Wildcat had proven that survival mattered more than pure performance. That bringing pilots home was worth extra weight. That armor and self-sealing tanks were not luxuries but necessities. John Thach continued serving throughout the war. He rose to command level, developing new tactics as Japanese desperation led to kamikaze attacks. His big blue blanket system, layers of fighters positioned at different altitudes around carrier task forces, protected American ships from suicide attacks. He retired as a full admiral in 1967, having shaped American naval aviation doctrine for 3 decades. Edward O'Hare, Thach's protege who had tested the Weave in practice, did not survive the war. On November 26, 1943, O'Hare was flying night combat air patrol when his aircraft was shot down. He was 29 years old. The Medal of Honor he received for his actions in February 1942 was not enough to save him from a night ambush. Chicago's O'Hare International Airport bears his name, a permanent reminder of what he gave. Robert Dibb, Thach's wingman who executed the Weave at Midway, survived the war. He never spoke much about June 4, 1942. Years later, when asked about the engagement, he said simply, "We did what Commander Thach taught us. We stayed together. We came home." The Wildcat itself ended production in 1945. 7,860 aircraft built. General Motors produced nearly 3/4 of them after Grumman shifted focus to the Hellcat. The stubby fighter with inadequate performance had served throughout the war, adapting to roles its designers never imagined. One Wildcat found an unexpected legacy in America's space program. When Grumman won the contract to build the Apollo lunar module, engineers who had worked on the Wildcat's folding wing mechanism applied similar principles to the lunar module's landing gear. The same engineering that allowed Wildcats to fold their wings for carrier storage allowed the lunar module to deploy its legs for moon landings. Virgilio Sturiel and Marcello Romanelli, both Grumman veterans, designed the system. The fragile, foil-clad spacecraft that carried Americans to the moon traced its lineage to a fighter that held the line when America needed it most. The title, Flying Coffin, never officially applied to the Wildcat. That nickname belonged to other earlier aircraft that genuinely killed their pilots through design flaws. But in those first desperate months of 1942, when American pilots climbed into Wildcats knowing they would face superior fighters flown by superior pilots, the aircraft must have felt like a coffin. Slow, heavy, outmatched in every measurable way. Flying a Wildcat against Zeros was not just dangerous. It was nearly suicidal unless you knew exactly what you were doing. Unless you had a commander like Thach who refused to accept technological inferiority as fate. Unless you had wingmen who would weave with you, cross paths with you, die with you if necessary to protect each other. The mathematics said American pilots should have lost. The Zero was faster, more maneuverable, better climbing, longer range. In any comparison of pure aircraft performance, the Zero won. But war is not fought by aircraft alone. War is fought by people. People who adapt. People who innovate. People who refuse to accept that superior equipment guarantees victory. John Thach, sitting at a table in his quarters aboard Saratoga, moving matchsticks around, found a way to win with inferior tools. He could not make the Wildcat faster. He could not make it more maneuverable. He could not give it the climb rate or turn radius of a Zero. But he could give American pilots a tactical framework that transformed weakness into survivable combat. The Weave was not heroic. It did not allow for dramatic individual victories. It did not let pilots prove their skill in one-on-one dogfights. It was mechanical, defensive, dependent on teamwork rather than individual brilliance. Everything American culture celebrated in fighter pilots, the Weave suppressed. But it worked. And in war, working matters more than glory. On the morning of June 4, 1942, 6 Wildcats and 12 Devastators flew toward the Japanese fleet. By mid-morning, 1 Wildcat had been destroyed, 1 damaged, and 11 Devastators shot down. The cost was terrible. But the Americans had proven something that would echo through the rest of the war. Inferior equipment, handled correctly, could achieve victory against superior opponents. The torpedo bombers failed in their primary mission, but their sacrifice allowed dive bombers to strike undefended targets. The Wildcats failed to protect the bombers, but their weaving defense forced Zeros to split attention between bombers and fighters. Nothing went according to plan. Everything worked anyway, because American forces had learned to coordinate, to adapt, to pay terrible costs in pursuit of strategic objectives. The Wildcat never became legendary like the Mustang or Spitfire or Corsair. It was too ugly, too slow, too compromised by its design origins. But for 20 months, from December 1941 to August 1943, the Wildcat was all America had. 20 months when carrier decks in the Pacific launched Wildcats to face superior enemies. 20 months when pilots wrote letters home before missions because survival seemed unlikely. 20 months when the war's outcome balanced on whether American pilots could overcome the Zero's technical advantages through tactics and teamwork. They did. The statistics prove it. 6.9 kills for every loss. 1,327 enemy aircraft destroyed. 58 aces produced from Wildcat squadrons. 8 medals of honor awarded to Wildcat pilots. More than any other fighter type. These numbers exist because pilots like Thach refused to accept that technological inferiority meant inevitable defeat. They exist because wingmen like Dib trusted their leaders and executed maneuvers they had barely practiced. They exist because engineers like Grumman built aircraft sturdy enough to bring damaged fighters home. Thank you for staying until the end of this story. Your time and attention are not wasted. Through watching, the memory of those lost in World War II continues. If you wish to help preserve that memory, please subscribe to Silent Battlefield. The morning of June 4, 1942 began with 6 Wildcats escorting 12 Devastators toward impossible odds. It ended with 4 Japanese carriers sinking beneath the Pacific and American forces holding Midway Island. The Wildcat did not win the Battle of Midway. Dive bombers won that battle. But the Wildcat kept American pilots alive long enough to fight future battles. It proved that courage and innovation could overcome technological superiority. And in doing so, it became something more valuable than the fastest or most maneuverable fighter in the sky. It became the fighter that held the line. The fighter that brought pilots home. The fighter that gave America time to build better aircraft while teaching pilots how to win with what they had. The F4F Wildcat was never meant to fight the Zero. But when history demanded it fight anyway, American pilots found a way. They found John Thach's Weave. They found teamwork and coordination. They found that survival mattered more than glory, that coming home mattered more than individual kills, that winning the war mattered more than winning individual dogfights. The Wildcat's greatest victory was not at Midway or Guadalcanal or any single battle. Its greatest victory was teaching American naval aviation that technological inferiority was not destiny. That the best weapon was not always the fastest or strongest, but the one handled most intelligently by people who refused to quit. In the dark days of 1942, when Japanese forces seemed unstoppable and American forces seemed hopelessly outmatched, the Wildcat gave American pilots something more valuable than speed or maneuverability. It gave them time. Time to learn. Time to adapt. Time to survive until better fighters arrived. Time to become the pilots who would eventually sweep Japanese aviation from the Pacific skies. The Zero was the better aircraft. History proves this beyond argument. But the Wildcat was flown by better systems, better tactics, better training, and pilots who understood that war is not won by individual machines but by coordinated forces working toward common objectives. That lesson, learned in blood over the Pacific in 1942, shaped American military doctrine for generations. The stubby fighter with the partially exposed landing gear and inadequate performance was never beautiful. It was never beloved. Pilots who flew it did not write poems about its grace or speed. But they came home. They survived. They lived to fly Hellcats and Corsairs and eventually jets. They lived to teach new generations. They lived to remember friends who did not come home. Friends who flew Wildcats into impossible situations and somehow found ways to win anyway. That was the F4F Wildcat's legacy. Not glory. Not technological superiority. Not dominance in combat. Just survival. Just enough performance, combined with enough innovation and enough courage, to hold the line until American industrial might could produce fighters that matched or exceeded the Zero. The Wildcat bought America the most valuable commodity in war: time. Time measured in months. Time paid for in pilots' lives. Time purchased with tactical innovation and stubborn refusal to accept defeat. On June 4, 1942, when John Thach led 6 Wildcats against 15 Zeros, he proved that time was not yet up. That American pilots could still fight, still win, still survive against superior enemies. The Weave was not perfect. The Wildcat was not perfect. Nothing about those desperate early months was perfect. But it was enough. And sometimes, in war, enough is all you need. Thank you for staying until the end of this story. Your time and attention are not wasted. Through watching, the memory of those lost in World War II continues. If you wish to help preserve that memory, please subscribe to Silent Battlefield.